Cave diving in a coastal grotto, exploring tight spaces. The narrow tunnel opened into a larger cavern. Relief turned to terror as something moved in the darkness. A pair of eyes reflected the dive light, then another. The cavern was filled with massive, sleek bodies, trapped in an underwater lair of apex predators. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the orca attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden light over the jagged coastline of Norway. The air was crisp, fresh, filled with the scent of salt water and pine trees. Lars adjusted his jacket as he stepped onto the weathered dock, his boots creaking with every step. The ocean stretched before him, a wide expanse of gray-blue that seemed to go on forever, its surface smooth like glass. Ready to get started? Lars called over his shoulder to his son Emil, who was busy tying knots on the fishing lines. Emil looked up and grinned, a flash of excitement lighting up his face. "You bet, Dad. This is going to be the best trip yet." Lars smiled back, his weathered face softening. He had always enjoyed these quiet trips with his son. Just the two of them, out on the water, away from the distractions of everyday life. It had become their tradition, a rare chance to bond without the pressures of work or school. "I hope you're right," Lars said, checking the boat one more time. It was small, an old fishing vessel, but sturdy enough for the trip. It had been in the family for years, passed down through generations. The engine sputtered to life with a grumble, and Lars nodded in satisfaction. "All right, let's go." The engine hummed steadily as Lars steered the boat away from the dock. Emil stood beside him, holding onto the side of the boat, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This place is beautiful," Emil said, his voice filled with awe. "I can't believe we're finally out here again." Lars nodded, his gaze fixed on the open water. The vastness of the ocean always made him feel both calm and small, but today, something felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but a subtle unease had begun to settle in the pit of his stomach. He shook it off, trying to focus on the task ahead. It was just nerves, nothing more. "Where are we heading?" Emil asked, pulling a tackle box from beneath the seat. "Out deeper today," Lars replied, pointing ahead. "The fish should be more plentiful there. We'll set up camp, do some fishing, then head back before the wind picks up. It'll be a long day." Emil nodded enthusiastically, clearly eager for the adventure. He unhooked a fishing rod and cast it into the water, his face lighting up as the line settled into the depths. The boat drifted gently, carried by the current. The peaceful hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence of the vast, empty expanse around them. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The sun rose higher, warming their backs as the boat gently swayed on the water. The occasional splash of fish leaping out of the sea broke the monotony. Emil was focused on his fishing, his face intent as he carefully reeled in his line, while Lars adjusted the sails and kept a wary eye on the surroundings. After some time, Lars noticed the water seemed quieter than usual. The typical sounds of seagulls and distant waves crashing against the rocks were absent. Even the wind had died down, leaving the air unnervingly still. "Did you hear that?" Lars asked, his voice low. He squinted into the distance. Emil glanced up, confused. "What? I thought I heard something. A strange sound, maybe." "A whale." The sound came again, low, rumbling like a far-off growl or a distant horn. It was deep, almost subterranean, reverberating through the water. Emil's face grew pale. "That's weird," he said softly. "I don't think that's a whale." Lars stared at the open water, a knot forming in his chest. He tried to brush it off as nothing, but the noise came again, louder this time. It seemed to come from the depths, a deep, ominous sound that sent a chill down his spine. He looked at Emil, whose expression had shifted from excitement to unease. "Let's keep an eye on it," Lars said, his voice edged with tension. He turned the boat to head toward deeper waters, thinking the disturbance would pass, but the noise only grew louder as they ventured further. "I don't like this, Dad," Emil muttered, his voice tense. "It sounds wrong." Lars tried to reassure him, but the unease gnawed at him. Something felt wrong. He had been on this water countless times, but this was different. There was an unspoken danger in the air, and the longer they stayed out here, the more it seemed to close in around them. A dark shape broke the surface, a sleek dorsal fin cutting through the calm water. Lars's heart skipped a beat. Is that? Before he could finish the question, another fin appeared, followed by a third. The fins were large, unmistakable. They cut through the water with an eerie precision, gliding effortlessly beneath the surface. Emil's voice trembled. Dad, what are they? They're huge. Lars's stomach tightened as he realized what they were. Orcas, he said, barely above a whisper. A pod of orcas. Should we turn back? Emil asked, his voice rising with panic. Lars hesitated, his hand instinctively tightening on the wheel. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet thrum of fear creeping up his spine. I don't know, Emil. I've never seen them this close before. The orcas were circling them now, their large bodies emerging from the water with unnerving frequency. The boat rocked slightly with the movement of the creatures below. Lars could see their dark eyes glistening with intelligence, tracking their every movement. A sharp crack of water broke the silence. One of the orcas launched itself from the depths, breaching just feet from the boat. The force of its leap caused the boat to rock violently, throwing Emil off balance. He stumbled, grabbing onto the side for support. Dad! Emil screamed, panic in his voice. Lars's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, but his body froze for a split second. Then, without thinking, he slammed the throttle down, trying to power the boat forward, but it was too late. The orcas were closing in fast, faster than any predator he had ever seen. Their sleek bodies sliced through the water with terrifying precision. Hold on! Lars shouted as he fought. To keep the boat steady, another breach, even closer this time, and the boat rocked harder, the wood creaking under the force of the impact. Lars fought to regain control, but the engine sputtered, the boat's bow dipping dangerously low in the water. I don't know what to do, Dad. Emil's voice cracked, his eyes wide with fear. They're everywhere. Lars's heart raced and he gritted his teeth, trying to push the panic down. The orcas weren't retreating. They weren't running from the boat. Instead, they were circling, moving with eerie, calculated precision. Stay close, Emil. Don't let go of anything. But even as Lars said the words, he knew they were in grave danger. He had heard of orca attacks before, rare but deadly when they occurred. Orcas weren't just predators. They were intelligent hunters, capable of devastating force. The boat lurched again, the distinct sound of wood cracking under pressure filling the air. One of the orcas had rammed the side of the boat, sending a spray of water into the air. Emil screamed as he was nearly knocked off his feet, but Lars managed to grab him, pulling him back to safety. Hold on! Lars shouted again, but the words seemed hollow against the overwhelming sound of the ocean and the deep rumbling calls of the orcas. The boat began to tip, the water flooding over the sides as the orcas continued their relentless assault. The sharp, slicing fins broke the surface around them, each pass drawing closer, faster. Lars's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was no escape. The sea was too vast, and the orcas were too fast. They had no choice now but to fight for their lives in the open water. The horizon seemed so far away, but the orcas, ever patient, kept coming. And for the first time in his life, Lars understood the full weight of fear, the terror of being completely at the mercy of the ocean's most formidable predators. The ocean's surface had fallen silent, the deep rumbling noise that had unsettled them earlier now gone. But the unease remained. Lars's heart was still pounding as he stared out across the water. The orcas were gone, or so he thought. It was too quiet, too calm, the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Dad, what if they're still here? Emil's voice trembled from behind him. He had tried to stay calm earlier, but now the fear was creeping into his words. Lars didn't answer right away, instead keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had been out here enough times to know when something felt off. Something was wrong. Let's just keep going, Lars said, his voice more confident than he felt. We're going to head toward the shore. They probably moved on. Let's not jump to conclusions. But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. Orcas didn't just move on. They were deliberate, calculating predators. Lars's grip tightened on the wheel as he tried to steady the boat, but the anxiety in his chest wouldn't ease. The water was too still. The boat cut through it without resistance, making almost no sound as it glided forward. Emil shifted uneasily beside him, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. "I don't like it, Dad," Emil said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Lars replied. "But there's nothing we can do if they're not here. We just need to get to shore." He could feel the tension building in his son's body. The subtle shift of weight as Emil moved nervously beside him. Lars tried to maintain his composure, but his hands were starting to sweat, and his mind kept replaying the image of the massive, dorsal fins cutting through the water. Then, just as the boat passed a large outcrop of rock, there was a sudden splash. Lars's head snapped to the side, his breath catching in his throat. The unmistakable black and white shape of an orca shot up from the water, its body twisting in midair before it crashed back into the ocean with a thunderous splash. The force of the breach sent a wave rolling toward the boat, rocking it violently. "Dad!" Emil cried, his voice cracking with fear. Lars slammed the throttle down, jerking the boat forward. The engine roared to life, its sudden speed pulling them away from the scene, but it was too late. The orca had already re-entered the water, and now another breached even closer, only feet from the boat. This time the boat rocked hard enough to send Emil stumbling. He grabbed the edge of the boat, his knuckles white, eyes wide with terror. "They're back! They're coming for us!" Emil screamed, panic creeping into his voice. Lars gritted his teeth and turned the boat sharply, trying to outrun the orcas, but they were faster. The water churned violently around them, and before Lars could even process what was happening, the first orca slammed into the side of the boat, its powerful body striking with such force that the boat lurched to one side. The sound of cracking wood echoed through the air as the boat shuddered under the impact. Lars tried to regain control, but it was no use. The boat tilted dangerously, and Emil let out a terrified shout as he lost his balance, falling hard to the side. "Emil!" Lars shouted, reaching out for his son. But the water was already rushing in, the boat tipping further as the orca attacked again. A massive tail swept across the hull, splintering the wood and sending a cascade of water over them. Both. Lars fought to keep his footing, but the boat was sinking. "Get back!" Lars ordered, pushing Emil toward the center of the boat. "Stay in the middle." But the water was coming in too quickly. The boat was no longer seaworthy. The orcas weren't just toying with them anymore. They were hunting. Lars could see the dark shapes circling beneath the surface, their massive bodies moving with eerie precision. They weren't just waiting for the boat to sink, they were orchestrating the whole thing. Lars's chest tightened as the boat creaked under another blow. The sound of water flooding the hull was deafening, and Emil's terrified cries only made the situation worse. He grabbed Emil's arm, his grip desperate. "We need to get out of here, now!" Lars shouted, dragging his son toward the back of the boat, where they could at least hold on to the remaining bits of debris. But before they could even make it, another orca slammed into the side, this time flipping the boat entirely. Water poured in, swamping them both as they were thrown into the frigid sea. The cold hit them like a shock, taking the breath out of Lars's lungs. "Dad, I can't," Emil gasped, struggling to stay afloat. Lars reached out immediately, grabbing his son and pulling him toward a floating piece of debris. He clung to it with everything he had, pulling Emil beside him. "Stay calm," Lars ordered, his voice rough. "We just need to stay above the water." Emil's face was pale, his teeth chattering. The water around them was frigid, and every movement felt like it took all of their strength. Lars glanced around, but the boat was gone, sinking quickly beneath the waves. The orcas were still out there somewhere, circling, watching. The silence was unbearable, the only sound the occasional slapping of the waves against the debris they clung to. "I don't understand, Dad," Emil muttered, his voice shaking. "Why are they doing this? What do they want?" Lars shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know," he whispered. "But we need to stay quiet, stay still. Don't make any sudden movements." But as he said the words, a massive shadow moved beneath them, and the water seemed to shift with a dark, menacing energy. The orcas were still there, just out of sight, circling, waiting. Lars felt his heart hammer in his chest as he locked eyes with Emil. "I'm scared," Emil said quietly, his voice barely audible over the waves. Lars didn't know how to respond. There was nothing reassuring to say. They were trapped, stranded in the open sea with no boat, no help, and no real way to escape. The orcas were relentless. The water was growing colder, and the longer they remained exposed, the less chance they had of surviving. Suddenly, another splash echoed across the water. The unmistakable sound of an orca launching itself from the depths, breaching with a power that shook the ocean. Lars's breath caught in his throat as the dark shape emerged from the water, its sleek black and white body rising above them. Its eyes met Lars's for just a moment, and in that split second he understood. This wasn't about food or survival. This was something else. The orca's powerful tail swept down, sending a wave toward them. Emil screamed, clutching onto the debris as the water rushed toward them. The orca circled below, its large dorsal fin cutting through the surface with unnerving precision. It was waiting, watching. The ocean seemed to hold its breath as they floated in the open water, the orca still lingering below. They were just a small piece of driftwood in the vast expanse, a tiny moment of terror in the ocean's timeless depth, and Lars realized with growing dread that they were no longer in control. The predator was in charge now. The orca knew it. And soon, Lars would have to accept it too. The ocean around them was growing colder. The icy grip of the sea sank deeper into Lars' bones as he clung to the floating debris, trying to keep himself and Emil from slipping into the dark waters below. The orcas were still circling, moving just beneath the surface, their presence more unnerving with each passing moment. Emil's teeth were chattering, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he shivered violently, his hands numb from the cold. Lars kept his arm around him, trying to offer what little warmth he had left, but the reality of their situation was sinking in. They were stranded in open water, with nothing between them and the orcas but a fragile piece of wood. The sun had disappeared behind a cloud bank, casting a gray pall over the ocean. The waves, once calm, had started to grow, small ripples turning into gentle swells. The wind too had picked up, whipping across the water and sending a chill into the air. The light was fading fast and the temperature was dropping even lower. It was the kind of cold that numbed the fingers and made the body slow, sluggish, like it was forgetting how to fight. Lars had been out on the water for years. He knew the dangers, knew the power of the sea and the creatures that called it home. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. Not the sheer, unnerving intelligence in the eyes of the orcas, nor the way they had torn the boat apart as if it were nothing more than kindling. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the attack. Why had they done it? Orcas were not typically dangerous to humans, but there was something in the way they had moved, in the way they had attacked, the precision, the coordination, that told him this was no ordinary encounter. I can't feel my hands, Dad," Emil muttered, his voice breaking. His teeth clattered together uncontrollably. Lars tried to steady himself, but the cold was creeping into him too. His thoughts were becoming foggy, his limbs growing heavy. He had to keep his son awake. He had to keep them both alive. "Stay with me, Emil," Lars said, his voice hoarse. He pulled Emil closer, squeezing him tighter against the debris. "We can't let ourselves fall asleep. Stay awake, all right? Just a little longer." Emil nodded weakly, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. The terror was still there, but so was exhaustion. They had been out here for what felt like hours, and every second felt like an eternity. Every time they tried to move, another orca would surface, sending ripples of fear through them both. The water was dark, the visibility limited, and the pod was everywhere, beneath, around them, lurking in the depths. Lars knew they couldn't last forever like this. The cold would eventually take them if the orcas didn't. They needed to move, to find a way to escape. But the sea had become an unforgiving trap, its vastness swallowing their hope. There were no boats in sight, no help on the horizon, just them and the ocean. A sudden splash cut through the stillness of the water. The surface rippled violently, sending a spray of water into the air. Lars's heart leapt into his throat. As he scrambled to hold onto Emil, his grip tightening around the wet wood. "Dad! Dad, it's coming back!" Emil screamed, his voice raw with panic. He pointed toward the water, and Lars followed his gaze. The dorsal fin of the orca broke the surface first, a menacing silhouette cutting through the water. It was larger this time, its body sleek and powerful as it sliced through the sea, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Lars's breath caught in his chest. The orca was coming straight for them. "Hold on, Emil!" Lars shouted, his voice sharp, with urgency. His mind raced. He knew they couldn't outrun it. He knew they couldn't fight it. The only option was to stay as still as possible, to become a part of the ocean itself, to pray the orca wouldn't notice them. The orca was moving with predatory precision, circling them slowly, its enormous body twisting and turning beneath the surface like a shadow. Lars could see the glint of its white underside, the curve of its massive tail cutting through the water. It was close now, closer than ever before, and he could feel its presence as if it were an electric current in the water. "Please, don't let it come any closer," Emil whispered, his voice trembling. Lars didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too focused on the orca, too focused on the way it moved. The pod had spread out around them, but this one, the one that was coming toward them now, was the largest, the leader. Lars could tell. It had a cold, calculating look in its eyes, like it was sizing them up, figuring out how to make its next move. The boat had been destroyed, and now there was nothing but the debris between them and the sea and the orca. Lars's hand moved instinctively to Emil's shoulder, giving it a brief, reassuring squeeze. But his mind was clouded with panic, thoughts swirling like the waves beneath them. The orca was almost directly beneath them now, its shadow looming, larger with every passing second. It was waiting, watching. Suddenly, the orca shot to the surface with lightning speed. The water exploded around them as the massive creature breached, its body soaring through the air before crashing back down, with an ear-splitting splash. The force of the breach sent waves rippling in all directions, and Lars had to grab onto Emil to keep them from being separated. The orca didn't stop. It surged forward again, this time coming straight for the debris, its mouth open wide, showing rows of sharp teeth as it lunged. The sound of water slapping against the debris was deafening, but Lars's heart was the loudest noise in his ears. "Dad, it's coming!" Emil screamed again, his eyes wide with terror. Lars didn't have time to think. He grabbed Emil, pulling him to the other side of the debris, trying to keep as much distance between them and the orca as possible. His hands were slick with water, the wood of the debris slipping under their grip. The orca was still coming, circling faster now, closer with each pass. "I can't do this, Dad, I don't want to die," Emil sobbed, his voice breaking. "Stay with me, Emil," Lars said, his voice raw. "We're not going to die, I won't let you." The words felt empty as they left his mouth, hollow in the face of the reality before them. The orca wasn't just a predator. It was a force of nature, and no amount of pleading or fighting could stop it. They were at its mercy. The orca surged, again, this time with such force that it sent a wave crashing over them, nearly knocking them both into the water. Lars barely managed to hold on, his arm wrapped around Emil's waist as he pulled them back to the center of the debris. He could hear the orca's breath now, ragged and forceful as it surfaced, a cloud of mist rising from its blowhole. Mitsu, eyes were locked on them, cold and calculating. It was like it was waiting for something, waiting for them to make a mistake. Lars took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, trying to think. They couldn't keep this up forever. The orca was persistent, relentless, and they were losing strength. The cold was starting to take over, and the longer they stayed out there, the weaker they would become. But Lars couldn't give up. Not like this. He looked down at Emil, whose eyes were wide with fear, his face pale, shivering uncontrollably. Lars pulled him closer, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his gut. "Listen to me, Emil. We need to stay calm. We need to stay still." Emil nodded shakily, his eyes still fixed on the massive orca circling beneath them. They were helpless, completely at the mercy of the ocean and the predators beneath the surface. But Lars was determined to keep his son alive. They would survive. He had to believe that. The orca paused, its massive head rising just above the water. As it studied them, its black eyes unblinking. Then with one final surge, it disappeared into the depths, vanishing into the blackness below. The silence that followed was deafening, the world around them holding its breath. Lars felt his heart pounding in his chest, and he took a ragged breath, his grip still tight around Emil. "We're not done yet," Lars whispered, his voice low but firm. "We're going to make it." The water was eerily still, the only sound the faint lapping of waves against the debris they clung to. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ocean. The temperature was dropping rapidly now, and the chill was seeping into Lars's bones. He could see his breath in the air, clouding briefly before disappearing into the dying light. The wind had picked up again, sending a cold gust across the water. Emil was shivering uncontrollably in his arms, his face pale, eyes unfocused. His teeth chattered with every breath, his skin pale from the cold. Lars knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. Every minute that passed, the chances of survival were slipping away. "We need to stay awake, Emil," Lars said, his voice firm, despite the tightness in his chest. "Stay with me, just a little longer." Emil nodded, but Lars could see the exhaustion weighing on him. The terror was still there, that primal fear of the unknown, but fatigue was slowly overtaking him. Emil's hands were trembling violently, and his lips had turned a faint shade of blue. Lars pressed his hand against his son's back, trying to give him what warmth he could. But the cold was relentless. The orcas had disappeared for now, but Lars knew they couldn't rely on that. The ocean around them felt like a waiting trap, the silence unnatural, suffocating. He dared not let his guard down. One slip, one moment of inattention, and they could be gone. "We should have been found by now," Emil muttered, his voice weak. "Why is no one coming? Where's the coast guard? What if they don't come for us?" Lars swallowed hard. He wanted to say something reassuring, to tell Emil everything would be fine, but he knew it wasn't true. They had been drifting for hours, the shore nowhere in sight. They were alone. Alone in the middle of an ocean that had just proven it, could swallow them whole without hesitation. "I know," Lars replied, his voice rough. "But we can't stop hoping. They'll come, Emil. We just have to hold on." Emil nodded, but Lars saw the doubt in his eyes. It was hard to hold on to hope when everything around you was falling apart. The ocean was vast, the boat was gone, and they were barely staying afloat on a few scraps of wood. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the orcas, their black and white bodies slicing through the water, watching, waiting. A sudden movement in the water snapped Lars back to the present. His heart leapt into his throat as his eyes darted to the depths. For a moment he couldn't see anything, just the ripples of water where something had moved. Then, with a rush of water, another orca emerged, its dorsal fin cutting through the surface like a knife. "Dad!" Emil cried, his voice raw with panic. "It's back! It's coming!" Lars's blood ran cold. He could feel the familiar tremor of fear rising in his chest, but he pushed it back. He couldn't let Emil see his fear. Not now. Not when they needed to stay calm. "Stay still, Emil," Lars ordered, his voice hoarse. "Don't make a sound. Don't move." The orca was circling them now, its massive body gliding just beneath the surface, its eyes locked onto them. It was the same one from earlier, the leader of the pod. Its cold, calculating gaze never left them as it moved, gliding through the water with an eerie grace. Lars could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the orca's presence closing in on them. The water around them was beginning to churn, the orca getting closer. Lars could hear the sound of its breath, ragged and forceful, as it rose to the surface. Emil's grip on the debris tightened, his knuckles white. "Dad, what do we do?" Emil's voice trembled, his face pale with fear. Lars's heart raced. He didn't know what to do. There was no escape. The pod was out there, waiting for them, and he had no way to fight back. No weapons, no tools, no boat to carry them to safety. They were prey now, and the orcas were hunting. "Stay quiet," Lars repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Stay still, Emil. Don't move." The orca came closer, its sleek body cutting through the water, the dark shadow looming beneath them. Lars's stomach twisted. The tension was unbearable, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything to get away. But there was nowhere to run. Another orca breached the surface, this one even closer than the first. Lars could feel the water vibrating beneath him, the force of the creature's movement sending waves crashing over them. The orcas were moving in, closing in on their position. Lars's mind raced, trying to think of anything that could save them, but there was nothing. They were completely at the mercy of the predators surrounding them. The orcas didn't strike immediately. Instead, they circled, their eyes never leaving Lars and Emil. The silence between them was deafening, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Lars could feel the fear in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He had to stay strong, for Emil, for both of them. And then, without warning, one of the orcas lunged forward, its massive mouth opening wide. The water surged around them as the creature's body slammed into the debris, sending a shockwave through the water. The force of the impact nearly threw them both off the wood. "Hold on, Emil!" Lars shouted, grabbing his son and pulling him closer to the center of the debris. The orca continued its assault, slamming into the wood again, its powerful body forcing the debris to tilt dangerously. The water surged higher with each blow, and Lars could hear the cracks in the wood as the boats remained splintered beneath the orca's power. Lars gritted his teeth, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let go. He couldn't let Emil fall into the water. The orcas were circling closer now, the smell of salt and brine thick in the air as the creatures watched them. Lars could feel the weight of their presence, their intelligence. They weren't just attacking out of hunger, they were attacking because they could. "Dad, please," Emil cried, his voice rising with desperation. "I can't." Lars didn't let him finish. He shoved his son closer to the debris, his grip tightening on the wooden piece they clung to. "We're not giving up, Emil," Lars shouted over the roar of the waves. "We're going to make it out of this." But even as the words left his mouth, Lars knew they were running out of time. The boat was sinking, the debris was fragile, and the orcas were relentless. The water around them was churning, a deadly dance of predators closing in on their prey. "Please, please don't do this," Emil whispered, his voice breaking as the cold took hold of him. Lars couldn't answer. He had no answers. There was nothing he could say to make this better. All he could do was hold on, keep Emil alive, and pray that help would come before it was too late. The orca lunged again, this time with more force. It slammed into the debris, sending water crashing over them. The wood splintered under the blow, and Lars lost his grip, his hand slipping on the slick surface. For a split second he thought he was going to be pulled under, but he managed to grab hold again. "Emil!" Lars shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "Stay with me, Emil!" The orcas continued their assault, relentless, methodical. Lars could feel his strength waning. The cold was numbing him, and his body felt heavy, as if he were sinking with the ocean. Emil's body was limp beside him, his eyes fluttering with exhaustion. "Emil!" Lars shouted again, but his son's eyes were barely open, his breath shallow. The world around them was growing darker, and the surface of the water was rippling with the movements of the orcas below. Lars held on too, his son as tightly as he could, his chest tightening with panic. They were alone out here, and the sea was claiming them piece by piece. And yet, despite the hopelessness of the situation, Lars refused to let go. He wouldn't let Emil die out here, not like this. He would fight with every last ounce of strength he had left. As the orcas circled closer, Lars held his son tight, whispering through the terror, "We're not giving up, we'll make it, we'll survive." The ocean was a vast empty expanse stretching far beyond what Lars could see. The light from the setting sun had long disappeared, leaving only the cold, endless dark of the night ahead. The air was thick with salt and the sharp scent of brine, the taste of it heavy on Lars's tongue. The chill had taken full hold of his body now, his skin prickling as though it might crack under the weight of the cold. His teeth chattered, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Emil was silent beside him, his small form shivering violently in Lars's arms. The boy was barely conscious, his body limp against the debris they clung to. His head rested against Lars's chest, his breathing shallow, his face pale and drawn. Lars could feel the fever rising in his son's body, the hot flush against his cold skin, and it sent a fresh wave of panic through him. Emil had to stay awake, he had to stay alert. "Emil," Lars said softly, his voice cracking with fear. He shook his son gently, but there was no response. "Emil, you need to wake up. You need to stay with me." Emil stirred weakly, his eyelids fluttering open just a crack. He blinked, trying to focus on his father, but his eyes were glassy, unfocused. I can't feel my legs," Emil whispered, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was speaking from far away. "It's so cold, Dad." "I know," Lars said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't have the words to make his son feel better. He didn't even have the energy to hide the panic creeping into his chest. "We're going to be okay, help's coming, just hold on, Emil, please." But Lars knew the truth. Help wasn't coming. Not yet. And maybe not at all. He could feel the weight of their isolation like a physical presence, the enormity of the sea surrounding them, trapping them in its grasp. The world felt impossibly large, and they were so small, so insignificant in its shadow. Emil moaned, softly, his eyes closing again. The cold was seeping into his very bones, and every breath seemed to take more effort than the last. Lars pulled him closer, trying to shield him from the cold with his own body, but there was nothing to keep them safe. They were alone, lost in an unforgiving world. The Orcas were still out there, somewhere beneath the surface, lurking in the depths. Lars hadn't seen them in a while, but he knew they were still close. Orcas didn't just leave once they had marked their territory. They circled, they watched, and they waited. Lars's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that might help them survive. But every option felt useless. There was no shore in sight, no rescue in sight, and no hope that could change their circumstances. Every time he looked at Emil, the weight of it crushed him. He had failed his son. "Dad." Emil's voice cracked through his thoughts, weak and trembling. "I'm scared." Lars squeezed his eyes shut, his throat tight with unshed tears. The vulnerability in Emil's voice, the fear that he could do nothing to protect him from the ocean's cold embrace. It tore at him in ways he couldn't explain, but he couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Not when Emil needed him most. "I know, son," Lars said, his voice low but steady. "But we're strong. You're strong, you just have to hold on, do you hear me?" Emil nodded weakly, his grip on the debris tightening for a moment before slipping again, his hands too numb to hold on. He let out a small, helpless sound, and Lars adjusted his hold on him, positioning him more securely against the floating wood. The waves were gentle now, almost deceptively calm, but Lars knew the danger wasn't just in the waves or the cold. It was in the open water itself, the vulnerability of being at the mercy of the ocean and its predators. "I can't keep my eyes open," Emil mumbled, his voice thin and weak. His eyelids fluttered shut, and his body sagged against Lars, who held him tighter. "Emil, don't—" Lars choked on the words, fighting the lump in his throat. "You have to stay awake. We're going to make it through this, you hear me? You're going to be okay." The words didn't feel real. How could they? They were stranded in the middle of the ocean with no boat, no safety, nothing but the cold water beneath them, and the haunting threat of the Orcas circling below. But Lars couldn't afford to believe anything else. He couldn't let himself accept the idea of failure, of losing his son to the ocean. A sound broke through the silence, a distant whir like the sound of an engine, faint but unmistakable. Lars's head snapped up, his heart racing as he scanned the horizon. There was nothing but the rolling black of the ocean, the low hum of the water against the debris. But then it came again. A helicopter. Lars's pulse quickened as he squinted into the distance. Far off, just above the waterline, a small speck appeared in the sky. It was distant but unmistakable. It was a helicopter, its blades chopping through the air, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over them. "Emil!" Lars cried, shaking his son. "Emil, look, it's a helicopter! Help is coming!" Emil stirred weakly, his eyelids fluttering. He blinked slowly, trying to focus, but the cold had drained the strength from him. "I can't see it," Emil whispered, his voice barely audible. But Lars wasn't listening. He was already shifting his position, trying to lift Emil in his arms to hold him up, to make sure he could be seen, to make sure they weren't going to be missed. "Help!" Lars screamed, his voice raw with desperation. "Help! We're here! Please help us!" The helicopter hovered in the distance, the noise of the blades growing louder. Lars could see it now, clear against the fading light of the day descending toward them, the beam of its searchlight cutting through the night. "Stay with me, Emil," Lars shouted again, but his voice broke on the last word. He had never been more afraid in his life. What if they didn't see them? What if the helicopter was too far away to help? But the helicopter was coming closer, now its searchlight aimed in their direction. It was real. They were going to be found. Lars felt his heart swell with hope, the impossible becoming possible. Emil opened his eyes again, more alert this time. He stared up at the helicopter, his eyes wide. "We're going to make it, Dad?" Lars nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Emil. We're going to make it. Hold on. Just hold on a little longer." The sound of the helicopter blades grew louder, and Lars could see the figure of the rescue worker descending from the craft, the rope trailing down. The light from the helicopter illuminated the water around them. The dark expanse of the ocean suddenly shrinking in the presence of hope. Lars reached up, grabbing the rope, pulling it down toward him with all the strength he could muster. He didn't care about anything else. All that mattered now was getting Emil to safety. The moment the rope was in his hands, Lars looped it around Emil's chest, securing him tightly. With one final, desperate heave, Lars pulled his son up, lifting him from the water and into the safety of the helicopter. He barely had time to breathe before he was pulled up himself, the cold, harsh wind slapping his face as he was lifted from the ocean. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Lars allowed himself to close his eyes, feeling the weight of relief wash over him. They had made it. They were going to be okay. Lars sat on the edge of the makeshift cot in the small hospital room, the sterile scent of disinfectant in the air. His hands were still trembling, a lingering effect of the cold and terror they had endured. The warmth of the blankets around him felt strange, foreign, like something he hadn't known in ages. The constant hum of machines in the background reminded him that he and Emil were safe now, but the tension that had coiled around his chest for days hadn't loosened. Emil was asleep in the bed across from him, his pale face still flushed with fever, his breathing shallow. He had been sedated after they arrived, his body exhausted from the ordeal, and the doctors were doing everything they could to stabilize him. The nightmares were still there, Lars knew. They had seen the fear in his son's eyes even in the moments before he lost consciousness. But they were alive. They were alive. And that was something Lars couldn't take for granted. Lars's mind drifted back to the ocean, to the endless darkness that had surrounded them and the constant looming threat of the Orcas. He couldn't shake the images of those black and white eyes staring up at them from beneath the surface, cold and unblinking. He had never seen such a thing before, those creatures so purposeful, so deliberate in their movements. The attack wasn't random. They hadn't been prey, they had been targets. A knock at the door pulled Lars from his thoughts. He looked up to see a doctor step inside, a middle-aged man with a stern yet caring demeanor. Dr. Henriksen had been the one to first assess them when they arrived. Lars didn't know what to expect, but he had a feeling the news wasn't going to be good. "Mr. Johansson?" the doctor asked, his voice soft but firm. "How are you feeling?" Lars forced a smile, though it felt hollow. He was tired. More tired than he had been in years. But his body had somehow willed itself through it, focused only on one thing, getting Emil to safety. "I'm alive. We're alive," Lars replied, his voice rough. Dr. Henriksen nodded, taking a seat on the chair next to the cot. "You're in good hands here. Both of you. The trauma your son experienced is severe, but we've started the necessary treatments. His fever's high, but he'll recover." Lars felt a knot loosen in his chest, but the relief was fleeting. The physical wounds he could deal with, but the psychological ones, they were a different matter entirely. What about Emil's? What he's been through? The cold, the exposure? Lars asked, his voice growing more tense with each word. The doctor sighed, looking down for a moment before meeting Lars's eyes. Exposure to the cold was severe. We had to treat him for hypothermia and dehydration. His body's been through a lot, but he's a strong boy. The fever's expected. What worries me more are the psychological effects. You both were in a traumatic situation, and we'll need to monitor his mental health closely. He's going to have nightmares, confusion, possibly flashbacks. Lars clenched his fists, anger bubbling up in him. The Orcas, they weren't just attacking. They were hunting us. Why? What kind of animals do that? Dr. Henriksen's expression shifted and he leaned forward slightly. Orcas are intelligent, Lars, highly intelligent. What you witnessed wasn't a random attack. They knew what they were doing. They've been observed behaving this way before with boats, even with humans. It's not common, but it happens. Orcas are top predators in their ecosystem. They don't just hunt for food. They hunt because they can. What you went through was a rare but not unheard of interaction. And I'm afraid it will leave scars, both physical and mental. Lars rubbed his eyes, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had failed. He had failed his son. He had been so focused on keeping them alive that he hadn't even stopped to think about what would happen once they were safe. And now it was too late. Dr. Henriksen's voice cut through his thoughts. Lars, there's something you should know. We've contacted the authorities. Your case? The boat attack? It's under investigation. A lot of people want answers. What happened isn't normal. They'll be looking into it further. Lars looked up, his mind racing. You mean the Orca attack? They're investigating it? Yes, the doctor replied. They'll want to know more about the situation, the behavior of the Orcas, how you ended up stranded. It's going to be a lengthy process. Lars let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. The idea of reliving the events, of speaking about it all over again, made his stomach turn. He didn't want to talk about it. He wanted to forget, to move on, to make sure Emil was okay. I don't know if I can talk about it, doctor, Lars said quietly. I don't know if I can go through it again. Dr. Henriksen placed a hand on Lars's shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. You don't have to. Not yet. But I want you to know you don't have to go through this alone. We're here for you both. And Emil will need support. The psychological effects of this, it could take a long time to process. Lars nodded slowly, his mind numb. I don't know where to start, he muttered, mostly to himself. The doctor stood up, pausing as he reached the door. I'll check on Emil again soon. Try to rest, and if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. As the door closed behind him, Lars sank back onto the cot, his head heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He wanted to sleep, to shut his mind off. But the images were too vivid. The Orcas, circling beneath them, their eyes fixed on him. He could still hear the sound of their blows against the boat, the cracking wood, the desperation in Emil's voice. Dad. Lars looked up, startled by the faint whisper. Emil's eyes were barely open, but the boy was awake now, his body trembling beneath the blankets. He looked so fragile, so small. His once vibrant face was pale, his eyes clouded with confusion and fear. I'm here, Emil, Lars said gently, moving to his son's side. He took Emil's hand, holding it tightly in his. You're safe now. You're safe. Emil's voice was barely a whisper. What happened, Dad? Where are we? Lars leaned forward, brushing a lock of hair from Emil's forehead. We're in the hospital, son. You're going to be okay. Emil blinked slowly, trying to process the words. The Orcas. Did they leave us? Lars felt his heart break all over again. He didn't know how to explain it, how to make Emil understand what had happened. They had both survived something no one should have to. They're gone now, Emil. Lars said softly. We're safe, but we'll have to talk about it later. Okay. You need to rest. Emil nodded weakly, but his eyes were still filled with fear. I'm scared, Dad. I'm so scared. Lars held his son's hand tightly, trying to offer some measure of comfort. He knew that what they had gone through would stay with them for a long time, maybe forever. The fear, the terror, the sense of helplessness, they would all linger. But they were alive. They had made it out of the ocean, and that was something to hold on to. "I know you're scared," Lars said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we're together. We're safe, and that's all that matters right now." Emil's eyes fluttered, his exhaustion taking over again. "I don't ever want to go back to the ocean," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't ever want to see it again." Lars didn't have an answer for that. The ocean had been their enemy. It had been the thing that nearly took them both. The orcas, the cold, the helplessness, everything about the water had been a reminder of how fragile they were. But Lars knew one thing for certain: they would heal eventually. The memories would stay with them, but they would move forward. Together. "We won't go back," Lars promised, his voice steady. "We'll stay on solid ground from now on, son. Just rest now. You're safe. You're home." Emil's grip on his father's hand tightened for a moment before his eyelids fluttered closed again, and he finally drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. Lars sat there for a long time watching his son, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to heal. And that was all that mattered. The bright lights of the hospital room did little to wash away the heaviness in Lars's chest. Every time he looked at Emil, who was now awake but still fragile, a wave of guilt and helplessness washed over him. The boy's face was pale, his once energetic eyes now filled with a distant, fearful gaze that Lars had never seen before. The terror of the ocean, the relentless orcas, still clung to Emil like a dark shadow, even though they were miles from the shore now. Lars had been told that recovery wouldn't just be physical, it would be mental too, and that was the part that terrified him. What could he say to Emil that would make it better? What could he do to wipe away the fear in his son's eyes, to make the boy feel safe again? Lars had spent the last few days trying to be strong, trying to keep it together for Emil. But each time he was alone, the images of the attack replayed in his mind. The orcas circling them like they were prey. The crushing weight of helplessness, the moments where he thought they might not make it. The night had felt endless. The water cold enough to steal the breath from his lungs, and the sound of the orcas' blows against the boat, against their fragile sanctuary, haunted him. And now, here they were. Safe. But not really. Lars stood by the window looking out at the darkening sky, the city lights flickering in the distance. The world outside seemed so normal, so untouched by the nightmare they had just survived. His hand clenched into a fist at his side, the need to do something, anything rising in him. But he was powerless to change what had already happened. He turned when he heard the soft sound of Emil's voice. "Dad?" Lars quickly walked over to the bed where Emil lay, sitting down beside him, brushing his son's hair back from his forehead. Emil's fever had broken, but the exhaustion was still there pulling at him. His eyes were wide but unfocused, like he was struggling to piece together the events that had happened, the terror that had gripped them both. "Yeah, Emil. I'm right here," Lars said softly, his voice steady. He tried to hide the tremor he felt in his own hands, but his son had always been able to read him. I don't know how I feel," Emil admitted, his voice quiet and hesitant. "I keep seeing them. The orcas. I keep hearing the sound of the water, and it's like I can't get away from it." Lars's heart twisted at the words. He had expected this, but hearing it aloud, seeing the fear in Emil's eyes, felt like a fresh wound. "It's okay, son," Lars said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's normal to feel like that. You went through something terrible. But we're safe now. They're gone. You're safe." Emil turned his head, his eyes searching Lars's face as if he was looking for something, some sort of reassurance. Lars wasn't sure if he could give it. How could he promise that the fear would go away? How could he tell Emil that everything would be fine when the truth was, they would both have to live with the scars, the mental echoes of that night, for a long time? "But I'm scared, Dad," Emil said, his voice cracking with vulnerability. "I'm scared to close my eyes. What if they come back? What if they find us again?" Lars swallowed hard, pushing the lump in his throat down. He had to be strong for Emil. "Listen to me, Emil. Those orcas are in the ocean, they're gone. They won't come back for us. You're in a safe place now. We're not alone. We have people who care about us and we'll keep moving forward together, okay? Emil nodded slowly, but Lars could see the doubt in his son's eyes. The fear wasn't something that could be erased with a few words, and Lars knew that. He knew it wasn't that simple. Lars reached over and took Emil's hand, gripping it tightly. You're a brave boy. I'm so proud of you. You made it through something that would have broken most people. You're stronger than you think. Emil's eyes filled with tears and he blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. I don't feel strong, he whispered. Lars felt a pang of sadness in his chest. You are, Emil. You're stronger than I could ever be, and I'll be here. Every step of the way. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was quiet, save for the occasional beep of the machines keeping track of Emil's vitals. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. Emil's breathing had slowed, his grip on Lars's hand loosening as he seemed to fall into a peaceful sleep. Lars sat there watching him. He couldn't imagine what it was like for Emil, living through the terror of the attack in the cold. He couldn't imagine how his son was going to carry this with him for the rest of his life. But he knew one thing. He would never let Emil go through this alone. Later that evening, the doctor came to check on them both. Dr. Henriksen was a calm presence, always direct but compassionate in his approach. He had been the one to greet them when they were first rescued, and he had monitored Emil's recovery every step of the way. How's he doing? Lars asked, standing as the doctor entered the room. Dr. Henriksen gave a measured smile. He's stable, which is a good sign. The fever's down and we've managed to stabilize his hydration levels. But he's still very much in the recovery phase. Physically, he'll get better over time. But emotionally, it's going to take some time. Lars nodded. He knew it wouldn't be easy. It had never been easy. The Orcas' attack wasn't just a physical ordeal. It was a traumatic experience that would leave lasting scars. Lars wasn't sure how to help his son heal from that, but he would try. He had to try. The doctor continued, I'd recommend that you both take things slow. Don't rush back into anything, especially in terms of returning to the ocean. And keep an eye on Emil. Nightmares, flashbacks, they're normal at this stage. Lars rubbed his face, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to escape. I don't know how to help him with that. I don't know what to say. Dr. Henriksen placed a hand on Lars's shoulder. You're doing the most important thing already, being here for him. This is going to take time, but it's important for both of you to talk about what happened when you're ready. Don't hold it all in. It's okay to not have all the answers right now. Just be there. Lars nodded again, but it didn't feel like enough. How could he talk about it? How could he explain the terror they had faced without reliving it all himself? Dr. Henriksen gave him a kind smile. You're not alone in this, Lars. There's therapy available for both of you. If you ever feel like it might help, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, Lars said quietly. I'll keep that in mind. The doctor lingered for a moment before nodding and leaving, the room closing the door behind him. Lars sat back down beside Emil, watching his son sleep, his body still recovering, his mind still scarred. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew this. Emil wasn't alone, and neither was he. As the night deepened, Lars closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the future. They would move forward one step at a time. They would heal, even if it took time. And when the memories of the ocean's dark embrace crept back in, when the sound of the Orcas' calls rang in their ears again, they would have each other. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lars allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find peace again. The night had fallen too quickly, the sky already darkening as Emil sat on the edge of the bed staring blankly out of the hospital room window. The streetlights below flickered in the distance and the city hummed with its usual bustle. But to Emil, it all felt distant, unreal. The walls of the room, the soft beeping of the monitors, everything around him was an almost surreal contrast to the cold, unforgiving ocean he'd left behind. Lars was sitting nearby, his head resting in his hands, the weight of their ordeal still hanging heavily on him. Despite the calm that had settled over the hospital room, a storm still churned within him, an undercurrent of fear and doubt that he couldn't shake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ocean, dark and endless, stretching far beyond anything he could comprehend. And he could still feel the weight of his son in his arms, cold and shivering, as the orcas circled, them like predators. "Dad, do you ever wonder if we'll be okay again?" Emil's voice broke the silence, the quiet vulnerability of the question sinking deep into Lars's chest. Lars looked up slowly, meeting his son's gaze. There was a haunted look in Emil's eyes, one that Lars had seen too many times in the last few days. The boy was trying to process everything, trying to make sense of the terror that had almost taken them both. And Lars wasn't sure if there was anything he could say to make it better. "I don't know, Emil," Lars admitted, his voice heavy. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us, but I know we're alive, and that's a start." Emil turned his head back toward the window, his brow furrowed, his hands gripping the sheets tightly. "I keep hearing the water, Dad. I keep hearing their calls." Lars sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. He understood. He had heard. The sounds too. The deep echoing calls that seemed to vibrate through the water, reverberating in their bones. Even now, in the safety of the hospital, he could almost feel the ocean pressing in on him. Could almost hear the calls of the orcas, echoing in the back of his mind. "I know," Lars whispered, "but we're not out there anymore. We're not in the water. And we're not alone, Emil. I'm right here, and you're safe." Emil didn't respond immediately. He just stared out of the window, lost in thought. He had been quiet for days, only speaking when necessary, his eyes distant and unfocused. The trauma they had endured was something Lars could see weighing on him like an invisible burden. But Lars didn't know how to lift it, didn't know how to erase the terror that had become so deeply embedded in Emil's mind. "You know, I keep thinking about them," Emil said, his voice barely a whisper. "The orcas, how they knew exactly what they were doing. I don't think they were just attacking us. They were playing with us like we were part of their game." Lars's throat tightened at the thought. He had been trying not to dwell on the fact that the orcas hadn't attacked out of hunger or instinct. They had been deliberate, methodical, as though they had planned the entire encounter. And the more he thought about it, the more the fear of it seemed to intensify. "They weren't just playing, Emil," Lars said quietly. "They were hunting us, they were testing us, and they almost succeeded." He paused, swallowing hard. "But we survived. You survived." Emil nodded slowly, but his expression was distant. "I don't know how. I thought for sure we wouldn't make it." Lars moved closer, placing a hand on Emil's shoulder. "But we did. And we're going to be okay. It's going to take time. But we'll get there. We'll both get there." Emil shook his head, looking down at his hands. "I don't want to go back out there, Dad. I don't ever want to see the ocean again. It's too big, too empty. It feels like it's swallowing everything, like it's alive, and it just wants to take us." Lars's chest tightened at the words. He had tried to reassure Emil, tried to make him believe that they would find a way to heal. But Emil's words spoke the truth, one that Lars had been avoiding, one that felt too heavy to acknowledge. The ocean had nearly taken them both. It had felt endless, and they had been so small, so insignificant in comparison to the vastness of the sea and the creatures that hunted within it. "I understand, Emil," Lars said softly. "The ocean can feel that way. It can make you feel so small, so helpless. But I want you to remember something. It's not the ocean that's dangerous. It's the predators in it. And we're not going back there. We're not going back to that place." Emil didn't respond right away. He sat there, his fingers twisting the edge of the blanket, lost in his thoughts. Lars didn't push him. There was nothing more to say. Not yet. They both needed time. Time to recover. Time to process. After a long silence, Emil spoke again. "Do you think we'll ever forget it? The way it felt? The way we thought we were going to die out there?" Lars felt the question hit him like a blow to the chest. Could they forget? Could he forget the sound of the orcas' calls? The sight of their massive bodies cutting through the water, the way the boat had splintered beneath their weight? Could he forget the cold, the helplessness, the desperate primal fear that had surged through him as he held his son in the water? "I don't know," Lars admitted. "I don't think we'll ever forget it, but I think with time we can learn how to live with it. The memories won't go away, but maybe we can use them to make us stronger." Emil looked at his father, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared, Dad. I'm scared to close my eyes. I'm scared that the ocean will be waiting for me, that it'll pull me back in." Lars squeezed his son's shoulder, his voice low and steady. "It's okay to be scared, Emil. It's okay to feel like that. But you're not alone. You're here with me, and I'm not going anywhere." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Emil sat quietly, processing the things Lars had said, and Lars watched him, his heart breaking for the boy who had been through so much. How could he make it better? How could he fix the broken pieces of Emil's mind? Eventually, Emil leaned back against the pillows, his eyes growing heavy as the exhaustion caught up to him again. Lars sat with him, silently watching as his son drifted into a restless sleep, his brow furrowed with the weight of the nightmares that still lingered. Lars could see it, the fear still etched into Emil's features, even as he slept. He could see the way the boy's body tensed, the way his hands curled into fists. The memories would haunt him for a long time, and Lars wasn't sure how to help him. But he knew one thing. They would face it together. They would face the terror, the trauma, and the scars. But they would do it together. He wouldn't let Emil go through it alone. He sat there watching the rise and fall of his son's chest, and in that moment, Lars made a vow to himself. He would never stop fighting for Emil's safety, for his peace of mind. He would help him heal, even if it took a lifetime. The ocean might have tried to take them, but it hadn't. They had survived, and they would continue to survive. Lars didn't have all the answers. He didn't have a roadmap for how to fix what had been broken. But as he watched Emil sleep, as he saw the faintest trace of peace settle over his son's face, he knew one thing. They would be okay. One day they would be okay. Lars had always believed that the worst was behind them, that once they made it out of the hospital, once they could finally leave the sterile white walls and the constant beeping of machines behind, they could put it all behind them. The nightmares, the fear, the constant lingering memory of the Orcas' cold eyes would fade into the past. But as they stepped onto the quiet Norwegian streets with the familiar scent of pine trees in the air and the hum of distant traffic, Lars realized that the worst was far from over. Emil hadn't said much since they left the hospital. He had grown quieter in the days that followed their return home. It wasn't the same Emil that Lars remembered, the boy who was always quick to smile, quick to tell a joke. Now, he seemed distant, lost in his thoughts. And though Lars tried to reassure him, tried to make him see that they were safe, that the world was as it should be, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emil wasn't hearing him, that the boy wasn't living in the same world anymore. The house was quiet when they arrived, a stark contrast to the noise of the city. Lars set down his duffel bag by the door and looked around at the familiar surroundings. It should have felt comforting, returning home after everything they had been through. But there was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to hang over the place, just like the ocean still hung over them both. Emil dropped his bag in the hallway, his steps slow, reluctant. He didn't look around at the room that once felt like a sanctuary. Instead, he kept his gaze on the floor, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "You all right, Emil?" Lars asked, his voice gentle but firm. He watched his son, waiting for a response. Emil shrugged, still not looking up. "I guess." Lars's heart tightened at the emptiness in Emil's voice. It was the first time he had heard his son sound so detached, so hollow. "You can talk to me, you know," Lars said, moving closer to Emil, trying to catch his eye. "I know things have been hard, but we'll work through it. Together." Emil shook his head. "I don't want to talk about it, Dad. I don't even know what to say." His voice cracked as he said the last words, and Lars could see the strain in his son's shoulders, the way his body was trying to keep it all inside. "I know," Lars said softly, his hand resting lightly on Emil's shoulder. "But if you ever want to, I'm here. You don't have to hold it all in. You don't have to keep pretending that you're okay when you're not." Emil stayed, silent for a long moment, his face still turned away from Lars. The boy's shoulders trembled, and Lars could see the strain building in him. The fear, the exhaustion, the terror they had both experienced. "I'm not okay, Dad," Emil whispered, his voice barely audible. "I keep hearing them. I keep seeing their eyes, the orcas. I keep hearing the water, and I don't know how to make it stop. I don't want to sleep because I'm afraid I'll go back there. Back to the ocean." Lars's heart shattered, hearing his son say the words aloud. He had known that Emil was struggling, but hearing the depth of it, the rawness of the fear, was something else entirely. The trauma had taken root, deeper than Lars had realized, and it wasn't something they could just walk away from. "You're not alone in this, Emil," Lars said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled his son into an embrace, holding him tightly as Emil began to cry, quietly at first and then with increasing intensity, as though the dam that had held everything back had finally broken. Lars held him as he cried, rubbing his son's back gently, offering him the comfort he so desperately needed. "I'm here. I'm always going to be here for you. We'll get through this, I promise you." Emil clung to him, his sobs muffled against Lars's chest. "I don't want to be scared anymore, Dad. I don't want to feel like I'm still in the water, like I'm drowning." Lars swallowed hard, fighting back his own tears. The fear his son felt, the helplessness, the terror, was something he couldn't fix with words alone. But he could be there. He could help Emil face the darkness even if it took everything in him. "We'll face it together, son," Lars whispered, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "I know it's hard. I know it feels like it'll never end, but we'll take it one step at a time. And you don't have to face it alone." Emil pulled away slightly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked up at his father, his expression torn. "But how do I stop feeling like I'm still there? How do I stop hearing them? How do I make it stop?" Lars took a deep breath, thinking carefully about what to say. He didn't have all the answers. There were no easy fixes, but he had to try. "For Emil, maybe we can't make it stop overnight," Lars said gently. "But you're not going back there, Emil. You're here. You're safe, and we're going to take it slow. We'll face each day together, and we'll talk when you need to. We'll find a way to deal with the fear together." Emil nodded slowly, wiping his nose and looking down at his hands. "I don't know if I'll ever feel okay again." Lars crouched down so he was eye level with Emil, trying to catch his gaze. "You will," he said, his voice firm, though there was a sadness in it. "You will, but it takes time, and we're going to give ourselves time. Don't expect yourself to be okay right away. It's going to be a long road, but we'll walk it together." Emil didn't answer. He simply nodded, his eyes downcast, his expression unreadable. Lars wanted to reach inside to take away the pain his son was feeling, but he knew he couldn't. All he could do was stand by Emil's side, offer him the safety of his presence, and let him take things at his own pace. The next few days passed slowly, with neither of them fully settling back into their old routine. Emil spent most of his time in his room, lost in his thoughts, and when he did leave, it was often in silence. Lars noticed the signs, the jump in Emil's eyes at sudden sounds, the way his shoulders would tense at the sound of rushing water, the way he would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath, as though he was still trapped in the ocean. Lars did what he could, keeping the house quiet, making sure Emil felt safe and offering comfort when it was needed. But nothing could erase the trauma. Nothing could make the memories of the orcas, the ocean, the cold disappear. One afternoon, a week after they had returned home, Emil spoke again, breaking the silence that had become so heavy between them. "Dad," Emil said, his voice hesitant, Do you think I could ever go back out there? You know, to the ocean?" Lars looked up from his work, surprised by the question. He had expected it to take longer for Emil to even think about the ocean again. He had expected more resistance, but there it was, the question hanging in the air between them. "I don't know, son," Lars replied honestly. "It's okay if you don't want to go back out there, we don't have to. But if you ever feel ready, we can talk about it. We'll take it slow." Emil looked out the window, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I want to, but I feel like I need to face it, like I can't just keep running from it." Lars studied his son carefully. He could see the conflict in Emil's eyes, the fear and the determination warring within him. It would take time, and even if Emil wasn't ready now, maybe one day he would be. But Lars wasn't going to push him. Not yet. We'll face it together whenever you're ready, Lars said softly. And in that moment, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, Lars knew that no matter what the future held, no matter how long it took, they would get through it. Together. It had been over a month since they had returned home, since the ocean had tried to take them both. In that time, Emil had begun to show small signs of recovery. But there were days when the fear would creep back in, when the shadows of the Orca's eyes seemed to haunt him all over again. Lars had watched his son fight through it, his resolve to not be broken evident in the quiet moments when Emil would simply sit in silence, trying to push the past further away. But Lars knew better. The ocean would never be that far behind them, not until Emil could finally make peace with what they had endured. It was a late afternoon when Emil spoke again, breaking the quiet that had settled over the house. Lars was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his mind wandering to thoughts he didn't want to have. But the sound of Emil's voice shook him out of his reverie. "Dad," Emil said, his voice steady but tinged with something Lars hadn't heard in a while, an openness that made his heart skip a beat. "I've been thinking about going back to the water." Lars froze, the weight of the words settling, like a heavy stone in his chest. He had expected this moment, but hearing it out loud, hearing Emil say it with such finality, brought an entirely different flood of emotions. "Are you sure, Emil?" Lars asked, his voice quieter than he intended. He turned to face his son, who was standing by the door, his eyes trained on the floor, his expression serious. "I know it's been hard, and I know you're scared. It's okay if you're not ready. We don't have to do this." Emil took a deep breath, his eyes flicking up to meet Lars. "I don't want to be scared of it anymore. I don't want to live with the fear, Dad. I can't keep feeling like the ocean is out to get me. I don't know if I'm ready, but I think I need to try. I need to face it." Lars's throat tightened at the words. He had always known that. Eventually, Emil would want to return to the place that had scarred him. But knowing it and hearing it were two very different things. He had seen the damage the ocean had done to his son, both physical and mental, and he wasn't sure if he could stand by and watch Emil face the very thing that had nearly torn them apart. "You don't have to do this for me, Emil," Lars said, his voice low, filled with the concern that had gnawed at him ever since they returned. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. I've seen how much you've been fighting. You're stronger than you think. You don't have to go back to the water if you're not ready." Emil shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't want to be afraid of it anymore, Dad. I want to go back to being me, to feeling normal again. I don't know if I can, but I think it's the only way." Lars stood up slowly, walking toward Emil. He could see the determination in his son's eyes, the resolve behind the fear. It hurt to see Emil struggling with it, but Lars knew that this wasn't something he could fix with words. If Emil wanted to confront his fear, Lars would have to support him, even if it broke his heart to see him face it again. "If you want to do this, Emil, we'll do it together," Lars said softly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll go at your pace, but we'll do it. I'm not going to let you do this alone." Emil met his father's gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. "I don't know if I can make it, but I want to try." Lars nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The thought of returning to the water, of seeing the ocean again, filled him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. But he had to do this for Emil. For both of them. They didn't speak. For a while after that, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. It wasn't until the following morning that they made the decision. They would drive to the coast, to the very place where it had all begun. Lars had no idea what to expect, whether Emil would find peace or if the ocean would only drag them back into its depths. But they would face it together, as they had promised. The drive was quiet, the car filled with an uncomfortable tension neither of them knew how to shake. Emil sat with his arms crossed, his eyes staring out the window, the occasional flash of uncertainty passing over his face. Lars focused on the road ahead, the familiar stretch of coastal highways offering little comfort. Every mile they drove brought them closer to the place of their greatest terror, and Lars's heart seemed to beat faster the closer they got. Finally, they arrived. The familiar scent of salt water filled the air as they stepped out of the car, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks in the distance. Lars could see the wide, open expanse of the ocean before them, the same vastness that had almost swallowed them both. Emil stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the water. Lars could feel the tension in his son's body, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Emil was trying to find the courage to face the thing that had broken him. Lars knew this was the moment, the defining moment that would determine whether they could heal or whether the ocean would continue to haunt them forever. "You don't have to do this," Lars said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you're not ready, we can leave." But Emil didn't answer right away. He just stared at the waves, the sound of the ocean lapping at the shore seeming to draw him in. For a long time he stood there, his body tense with the strain of it all. Finally, he turned to Lars, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I have to do this," Emil said, his voice steady, though his hands were shaking. "I can't keep living in fear. I need to know that I'm stronger than what happened out there, that I'm stronger than the ocean." Lars nodded, his heart heavy with emotion. "We'll do it together," he said, placing a hand on Emil's back, offering the only support he knew how. One step at a time, the two of them walked slowly toward the water's edge, the sand cold beneath their feet. As they reached the shoreline, Lars stopped, watching as Emil knelt down, his fingers brushing the surface of the water, his eyes never leaving the ocean. The waves crashed against his hand, the cold shock of it sending a shiver up his arm. For a moment, Emil remained still, his face unreadable. Lars could see the fear still lingering in his son's eyes, the fear that had never fully gone away. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't been there before. A quiet strength, a determination to face the thing that had once broken him. Emil stood slowly, looking up at Lars. "I'm ready," he said quietly. "I don't know if it'll ever stop hurting, but I'm ready." Lars felt a lump form in his throat as he watched his son. He wanted to say so much, wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, that the fear would go away. But instead, he just nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He wasn't sure if they would ever be free of the memories, of the fear that the ocean had instilled in them. But they would face it together, one step at a time. "We'll make it, Emil," Lars said softly, his voice full of pride. "We're stronger than we know." And with that, they stood together, the vast ocean before them, the past behind them, and the future uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of hope in the air. Together, they had taken the first step toward healing.